The story of the American fortress is not one of crumbling stone and ivy-choked battlements, but a living, breathing chronicle of ambition, conflict, and an unyielding drive for security. It is a 423-year saga where the principles of medieval defense, the high wall, the strategic stronghold, the repelled siege, were translated from the old world's castles into the new world's desperate struggles for survival and dominance. This is the tale of how a scattering of vulnerable outposts, employing the timeless arts of siege and defense, forged itself into a continental power, its borders ultimately becoming the ultimate, unbreachable curtain wall. Part I, Palisade and the Wilderness 1607–1692. The first English footsteps on the swampy shores of Jamestown in 1607 did not bring grand castles of stone. They brought an idea, one as old as William the Conqueror: build a defensible position. What rose from the Virginia mud was not a donjon but a wooden palisade, triangle of sharpened logs connecting three bulwarks named for King James's sons, Henry, Charles, and Henry again. It was a crude motte and bailey in a land without moats, a desperate assertion of order in a chaotic, unknown world. The settlers were not master masons, but they were students of a brutal curriculum. They knew the Spanish to the south had fortified St. Augustine with the stone Castillo de San Marcos, a true Renaissance Tres Italienne bastion designed to repel both cannon and conquistador. Their own feeble palisade was all that stood between them and the powerful Powhatan Confederacy. The tactics were pure medieval siegecraft. The colonists inside were the garrison. The wilderness outside was the besieging army, and the moat was the vast, impenetrable forest. The fragility of this defense was horrifically exposed in the uprising of 1622. The Powhatan, understanding the Europeans' reliance on their fortified points, launched a coordinated attack not on the walls of Jamestown itself, but on the outlying settlements, defended, bayless, of the colony. They used the oldest trick in the besieger's book, the feint of peace. On the morning of March 22, they came unarmed, bearing food, mingling with the colonists in their homes and fields. Then, at a predetermined signal, they seized whatever tools and weapons were at hand, and fell upon the unsuspecting English. The scene was one of pure, unmitigated slaughter. A colonist, Richard Pace, was warned by his Native American servant Chanco, desperately through the pre-dawn fog to Jamestown to raise the alarm. But for hundreds, the warning came too late. Homes were burned, men, women, and children were cut down. The death toll was catastrophic, nearly a third of the colony's population wiped out in a few hours. The response was a grim lesson in escalatory siege warfare. The English abandoned their open settlements, and fell back on their strongest fortifications. They fortified their remaining homes with palisades, turning every plantation into a miniature keep. The conflict devolved into a war of attrition, a long, grinding siege against the entire Powhatan nation, characterized by raids, crop destruction, and a slow, relentless push to starve the enemy into submission. Further north, the Pilgrims at Plymouth in 1620 constructed their own simple fort atop what is now called Burial Hill, structure that served as both a stronghold and a meeting house. But it was the Puritans of the Massachusetts Bay Colony who would face a siege that would become the stuff of colonial legend. Conflict that tested their very souls as much as their stockades. The figure at the heart of this storm was a man who had once been inside their walls, Metacom, or King Philip, to the English. 1675, the decades of English encroachment, cultural imposition, and economic pressure had become an unbearable siege upon the Wampanoag way of life. Philip did not merely want to raid, He sought to break the English power in New England and entirely. He built a coalition of tribes, and the war that bore his name became the bloodiest, per capita, in American history. The warfare was a terrifying hybrid of Native American tactics and European siegecraft. Colonial towns were castles, and Philip's forces were a mobile, unpredictable besieging army. In the spring of 1676, the war came to the doorstep of Mary Rowlandson, the minister's wife in the frontier settlement of Lancaster, Massachusetts. The Siege of Lancaster. Personal account: the air in the Rowlandson house on February 10 was thick with cold fear. Outside, the war whoops of the Nipmuc warriors echoed a sound that froze the blood. The house, many in the town, had been hastily fortified, windows barricaded, doors reinforced. It was a keep under assault. "They are upon us?" a man shouted, his voice cracking as he peered through a crack in the shutters. Hundreds of them. The first musket balls thudded into the thick timber walls. Thump, 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 came the fire arrows, arching over the palisade and landing on the roof with a sinister hiss. Smoke began to curl into the main room. "Water! To the roof!" the garrison commander yelled, scrambled up the ladder, beating at the flames with blankets, and dumping buckets of precious water. Mary huddled with her 3 children and neighbors, the sounds of battle a deafening cacophony. For 2 hours the small garrison held out, their muskets firing from loopholes, keeping the attackers at bay. The Nipmuc had the same tool that had felled countless European castles: fire. A new sound joined the chaos, the crackle of dry timber catching in earnest. Flames licked at the corners of the room, and the heat became unbearable. "The house is lost," someone screamed. "We must make for the garrison house." It was a desperate gambit. A sortie from a burning keep to a stronger one across the open ground. The door was thrown open, a flood of smoke and terrified humanity spilled out. Mary, clutching her youngest child, Sarah, was immediately swept into the chaos. "Stay close!" she cried to her other children. The tide of battle ripped them from her. She saw a man next to her struck down by a tomahawk. Then a musket ball struck her side, and another grazed her side. She stumbled, falling into the snow. When she looked up, she was staring into the face of a warrior. Her 6-year-old daughter Sarah, wounded in the same attack, would die in her arms days later. Mary Rowlandson was now a captive, a prize of a successful siege. King Philip's War was ultimately a failure for the native coalition. The colonists, after initial devastating losses, adapted. They employed Native American allies, like the Mohegans, and learned to fight in the wilderness. The final blow was a classic counter-siege. Colonial force surrounded and attacked Philip's stronghold in a swamp in Rhode Island. In the ensuing melee, Metacom was shot and killed. His death broke the back of the resistance. The frontier was secured, but at a horrific cost. 52 of the region's 90 towns had been attacked, and a dozen utterly destroyed. The colonial castle had held. Its outer baileys were drenched in blood. Part highway stone against cannon, 1692 to 1783. The 18th century introduced a new, more professional form of siege warfare to America. The conflicts of European empires, Britain versus France, were now to be fought in the American theater, and they required defenses worthy of Vauban, the great French master of military engineering. The French, building their empire along the St. Lawrence River, understood this perfectly. Masterpiece was Fortress Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. Begun in 1713, it was not a simple wooden stockade but a vast, stone-built bastion fortress, Gibraltar of the New World. Its walls were 30 feet high and 36 feet thick in places, bristling with over 100 cannon. It was designed to control the gateway to the St. Lawrence and to withstand a formal European-style siege. In 1745, it did just that. The British, fearing Louisbourg's power, launched a combined naval and land assault. The New England colonists, led by a merchant named William Pepperell, were the besieging army. They were not professional soldiers, but they were determined and resourceful. The siege was a textbook affair. The British fleet blockaded the harbor, cutting off supplies and reinforcement. On land, Pepperell's men dug trenches, saps, that zigzagged ever closer to the formidable walls, just as sappers had done at Constantinople centuries before. They established artillery batteries, pounding the stone ramparts day and night. Inside Louisbourg, the French garrison under Governor Louis du Pont de Chambon endured the relentless bombardment. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and the cacophony of exploding shells. The once proud walls began to crumble. After a 6-week siege, with his defenses breached and his morale shattered, du Chambon surrendered. The greatest stone fortress in North America had fallen. It was a stunning victory, proving that American forces could master the complex art of reducing a modern fortress. The ultimate test of the American fortress would not be against a foreign power, but against the very empire that had built many of them. The American Revolution was, in its strategic geography, a war for control of a continent's strongpoints. In the war's early, optimistic days, the rebels believed they could withstand the British army. This conviction was put to the test in the siege of Fort Washington, on Manhattan Island, in November 1776. It was a disaster that nearly ended the war. The fort, poorly sited and undermanned, was surrounded by British and Hessian troops. The Americans expected a traditional European-style siege with trenches and parleys. They did not get one. The British General William Howe, with overwhelming force, simply assaulted the outer lines. The Hessian troops, experts in close-quarters combat, stormed the defenses with bayonets fixed. The American garrison, under the incompetent command of Colonel Robert Magaw, was overwhelmed and forced to surrender in a matter of hours. Over 800 American soldiers were taken prisoner, a catastrophic loss of men and material. It was a brutal lesson. A poorly defended castle is a death trap. The American response to this disaster was to become a master of the strategic defense, not holding fixed positions to the last man, but of making the entire countryside a hostile environment for the besieger. This was the American Fabian strategy. It still required a decisive, defiant stand at a critical fortress. They found this opportunity at a place called West Point on the Hudson River. The Hudson was the key strategic corridor of the continent. Whoever controlled it could split the rebellious colonies in two. Understanding this, the Americans embarked on one of the most ambitious fortification projects of the war. They did not build a single castle, but a system of them. West Point was a complex of forts, redoubts, a massive iron chain stretched across the river to block British ships. It was an interconnected defensive network, a sprawling, landscape-sized castle guarding the new nation's spine. The commander of this vital fortress was the American Achilles, General Benedict Arnold. And herein lies the greatest mystery of the Revolutionary War, the treason that nearly delivered the Republic's most important stronghold into enemy hands. The treason at West Point, a meeting in the shadows. The scene is not one of cannon fire, clandestine negotiation. In September 1780, Major John André, the handsome and cultured chief of British intelligence, met secretly with General Benedict Arnold near West Point. Arnold, brooding, ambitious, and feeling slighted by the Continental Congress, had offered to sell the plans to the fortress for $20,000 and a commission in the British Army. The meeting took place in the woods on the night of September 21. Arnold, using his authority as commander, provided André with a pass and the incriminating papers. Detailed plans of West Point's defenses, its troop strengths, the weak points in its artillery placements, hidden in his boot. The chain across the river, Arnold whispered, pointing to a diagram. Its weakest link is here, near the redoubt. Concentrated naval barrage could break it. The powder magazine for Fort Putnam is vulnerable to a landing party here. André listened, the papers feeling like a brand against his skin. He knew he held the key to ending the war. With West Point in British hands, the Hudson would be theirs. The colonies would be severed, and Washington's army, stranded, would likely collapse. But the plan unraveled with the randomness of a stray cannonball. André, traveling back to British lines in civilian clothes with the papers still in his boot, was captured by American militiamen. They were initially fooled by his pass from John Anderson, Arnold's codename, but a search revealed the devastating documents. The news reached Arnold at his headquarters, at the Beverly House on the morning of September 24. He was sitting at breakfast with his staff and General Washington, who was arriving for an unexpected inspection. A messenger hurried in, handing Arnold a dispatch. His face paled. He excused himself, went upstairs to his wife, and whispered, "I am a ruined man. I must fly." He then mounted a waiting horse, and raced to the Hudson, where a British warship, the HMS Vulture, was waiting for him. He escaped just as Washington was discovering the full extent of his treason. The fortress had held, not by force of arms, but by a quirk of fate. The betrayal demonstrated, more powerfully than any battle, the supreme strategic importance of the stronghold. The defense of West Point had saved the Revolution. When the war ended at Yorktown in 1781, it ended with a classic siege. Washington and his French allies digging trenches around Cornwallis's army, slowly squeezing them into surrender. The final, decisive application of Old World siegecraft to secure a New World nation. Part III, The Unbreachable Wall, 1783, 1865 and beyond. With independence won, the new United States now faced the ultimate defensive challenge: how to secure a continent. The solution was not to build a single, massive castle, but to create a network of them, pushing ever westward. The old frontier forts, Detroit, Pitt, Dearborn, were the advance keeps in this grand strategy of expansion. They were points of control in a vast, contested landscape, protecting settlers and projecting federal power. The young nation's military academy, established at the very fortress that Arnold had betrayed, West Point, became the crucible where the art of fortification was studied and perfected. Its graduates, trained in the principles of Vauban and the latest engineering, would go on to design the coastal fortifications that became known as the Third System. These were monstrous, T-tiered masonry forts, Jefferson, Monroe, Sumter, designed to make the American coastline impregnable to any foreign fleet. They were the nation's curtain wall, its stone shield against the world. But the most profound and tragic test of the American fortress would come from within. By the 1860s, the nation was divided. The art of defense evolved with terrifying speed. The Civil War was the first truly modern war, and it turned the medieval concept of the castle on its head. The high walls and deep moats were replaced by earthworks, trenches, and artillery redans. The fortress was no longer a single structure, it was the landscape itself, sculpted for death. Where was this more evident than at the siege of Vicksburg, Mississippi, in 1863? Perched on high bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, Vicksburg was the Gibraltar of the Confederacy. Its capture was the key to controlling the river and splitting the South in two. General Ulysses S. Grant laid siege to it in May. What followed was a return to the most ancient and grueling form of warfare. Grant's army surrounded the city and began digging. A complex web of trenches, saps, and parallels crept closer and closer to the Confederate lines. Inside Vicksburg, civilians and soldiers alike were forced to live in caves and dugouts to escape the relentless artillery bombardment which poured over 22,000 shells into the city during the siege. The atmosphere was one of unending horror. A Confederate soldier, Ephraim Anderson, wrote of the constant shelling. The storm of iron came in a hurricane of fury. The very earth trembled. Food became so scarce that people ate mules and rats. The stench of death and decay hung over the city like a pall. After 47 days, on July 4, the garrison surrendered. The siege was over. The Confederate commander, John C. Pemberton, held his castle as long as humanly possible, but against the industrial-age siege methods of Grant, the walls, both natural and man-made, could not hold. The fall of Vicksburg, coupled with the defeat at Gettysburg the day before, marked the turning point of the war. The great continental fortress of America had been tested by civil war, and its integrity, bloodied, was preserved. Conclusion: from palisade to superpower. The journey from the wooden triangle of Jamestown to the earthworks of Vicksburg is the 423-year story of American defense. It is a narrative that begins with a fragile palisade facing a vast, unknown wilderness, and ends with a nation whose military and economic power becomes its own ultimate, global fortress. The principles remained constant: the need for a defensible position, the strategic value of strongpoints, the brutal calculus of siege and attrition. The tools evolved from sharpened wood to shaped earth and granite, and finally to the immense industrial and diplomatic power of the 20th century. The American castle is no longer made of stone. It is an intricate system of alliances, a network of global bases, an economic engine, and a technological shield. The underlying imperative is the same one that drove those first English settlers to drive logs into the Virginia muddy, to secure a perimeter, to protect a way of life, to ensure that the siege, in whatever form it takes, is always repelled. The story of America's rise is, at its core, the eternal story of building walls strong enough to withstand whatever lies beyond.